Hey guys, it's Erica from Century 21 Affiliated here in Lowell, Indiana, serving like Porter, Newton, Jasper counties, pretty much all in Northwest Indiana. Hope you guys had a good week. I am back again this week to talk about something that simultaneously seems very easy to understand, but has some hidden pitfalls and bonuses in some cases, and those are appraisals. So most people are familiar with the idea of what appraisals are. Somebody comes to your house, they look at it, they look at some other things, and tell you how much your house is worth. How an appraiser gets those numbers is they use records of sold properties that are comparable to yours. So same size, same location, the age, number of bedrooms, those things. They take your house facts, how many bedrooms you have, do you have a fireplace, how big is your garage, compare those to other sold houses in the same criteria, and then come up with the value. They're a little bit more, I don't want to say sophisticated because that's not really what it is, but a little bit more stringent on how they do it. When you work with a real estate agent and you look at comparable properties, it's more of a general idea of what your property is worth. And there's a reason for that, which I'll get to in a minute. Appraisers actually do it in a very, accountant type way. So if your house has a fireplace and this other comparable house does not have a fireplace, they will actually see on the appraisal where they've done the math, where they've subtracted $600 from the value of, they would add $600 to the value of this other property to account for the value of your fireplace. So it's basically pretty straightforward. Practically speaking, if you have an appraisal done, they don't take very long. They don't meet with you. They're not particularly worried about what you have to say about anything. They just come in, house is empty, they look at everything, they have a bunch of, clipboard with check boxes or whatever, and they fill it all out, go back to their office, do all this math, and come up with a number. It usually comes, if you're purchasing a house, it usually comes in towards 2/3 of the way through the process. You want to get through home inspections and a couple different things before the appraisal is done. A, because if there's any repairs that need to be made, and B, you don't want to pay for an appraisal if you think the deal's going to fall apart. So it usually comes, like I said, about 2/3 of the way. Appraisers can be pretty good about getting things back in a timely manner. Might take a week, might take a couple weeks. It all kinds of depends on the time of year and how busy everything is. The appraiser does not work for the buyer. The appraiser does not work for the seller. The appraiser doesn't work for any of the real estate agents. The appraiser basically works not even for the bank, but works with the bank. There were a lot of problems. Obviously, the real estate meltdown, they had these appraisers kind of driving by houses and saying, well, it's worth $1 million. And these banks wrote all these loans. And then, the whole story and the real estate market crash and everything. So there are now some pretty strict rules on who an appraiser can talk to and what they can do for people. Again, that becomes important a little bit later on if you have an appraisal issue. So the big issue with an appraisal is it comes back too low. So what that means is you've agreed to buy a house for $300,000. You go through inspection, everything's great, you're getting your mortgage, your bank, your mortgage company contacts an appraiser, and it's kind of a random system. They can't necessarily pick a specific one. They have a pool of appraisers. And they get assigned an appraiser. The appraiser goes out, looks at your house, does all their math, looks at the comps, and they're saying it's only worth $280,000. This is a problem because the bank isn't going to lend you $300,000 on a house that's only worth $280,000. So when this happens, and it happens probably less than you think, but it does happen, the agents get involved. So let's look at it from the buyer perspective, okay? The buyer can't get the mortgage if the house isn't worth what they're borrowing. So the buyer's like, well, I'm not paying $300,000 for a house that isn't worth it. So in a lot of cases, the buyer and the buyer's agent, depending on how badly they want the house, depending on the details of the deal, might be like, well, that's your problem. You can't sell me the house if it's not worth what we agreed on because my bank won't let me. You guys have an issue with this appraisal. Sellers, you need to figure it out. From the seller perspective, they are the ones that have to figure it out. So often what happens, again, depending on how cooperative the appraiser is, the seller's real estate agent will get a copy of the appraisal and look at the comps that the appraiser has used. And the nice thing is that these comps are available to all real estate agents as well as the appraiser. So you can, your agent will go in, pull them up, look at it, and say, well, no, this house is 10 years older than this other house, or the comparable used is a bi-level, I'm selling a ranch. And what they do is they kind of put together two things, kind of an attack, hopefully, in a nice enough way, but an attack on the comparables that the appraiser used, and at the same time provide more helpful appraisals to the appraiser. I'm sorry, more helpful comparables to the appraiser. Presumably, if you're selling, you sit down with your agent, there's this list of comparables that you've already used. Your agent should already have these, be able to pull them up, send them to the appraiser, and be like, what the heck, it's worth $300,000. We had multiple offers in 3 days, clearly it's worth it. So a lot of times, the reason why these things come in off, so a higher purchase price and a lower appraisal, is because the appraisal process is very much looking backward in time. They are required to use properties that have already closed. They do make some consideration about what the current market is doing, but they are required to look backwards. So what happens is if you have a house in a hot market, everything's selling fast and prices are going up, that's great for you today and for the other people in the future, presumably, but it's a problem for the appraiser because he's got to look backwards. So he may be pulling comparables that sold, hopefully within the past 6 months, but in the last 90 days, that doesn't necessarily account for this growing market. So a lot of times as the seller's agent, what your agent will do, buyer's agent too, hey, we have this growing market, properties have only been on the market for 5 days, the prices have gone up 10% in the past 6 months, there should be some accounting for this market movement. What happens if you have, not all the time, but most time what happens when you have an appraisal that's lower than your list price is the buyer and the seller, through their agents hopefully, start negotiations again, kind of. The options are basically four of them. One, you can walk away. The buyer can walk away in most cases because they can't get the mortgage. The deal is contingent upon getting a mortgage. Sorry, I can't get the mortgage. I walk away, I get Mary's money back. Usually nobody really wants that. The seller wants to sell, the buyer wants to buy. Option two is that you guys agree to just drop the price to the amount of the appraisal. So if you're at $300,000 on the purchase agreement, the appraisal's $280,000, the sellers and the buyers agreed that the purchase price is now $280,000, which doesn't really make everybody happy. Certainly makes the buyer happy, bank's satisfied, seller's not too happy. The other option you have is that the buyer brings the difference in cash to the closing. So again, $300,000, $280,000, buyer's got to bring $20,000. Generally, buyers don't have $20,000 laying around. You see this more often in cases where, it's a $2,000 difference or something like that. Usually that you can work that out. Again, now the seller's happy, buyer's not happy. Again, it depends on whose motivation is more important at the time. The other option is you split it. So let's say the difference is $5,000. So the seller says, okay, we're going to drop the price by $2,500. The buyer says, okay, we're going to bring $2,500 to closing. We all meet in the middle. The bank is happy because they're not overfinancing a property. The seller's moderately unhappy. The buyer's moderately unhappy. But, the best compromise is one where all the parties are kind of unhappy. Again, it can be tricky to work with an appraiser, so oftentimes getting an appraiser to change their appraisal is very, very difficult. There usually has to be some rather large error. Appraisers, God love them, I have friends that are appraisers, but they can be a little picky sometimes in how they do things and who they work with, and you got to kind of be nice sometimes and work it out. But again, usually most appraisals are off by maybe $5,000. I've had some higher ones, but usually they're within a realm where it can be worked out. So if you have a sale, if you have a purchase, the appraisal does not match up with your purchase price, depend on your agent to pull the comps, to work with the bank and the appraiser, and to work with the seller / buyer, whichever side you are, to come up with some kind of good compromise. So the second thing that comes up on appraisal is if you are using an FHA, a USDA, a VA loan. These are government loans. I think we've talked about this in the past. They have like a separate safety and structural checklist. The appraiser, when they come in to do that appraisal, Well, that's when that safety structural checklist gets, marked off, where they check for GFCI outlets, they check for railings and peeling paint and all the different things on those lists. That's one of the reasons why it's a good idea to have your appraisal later after the home inspection, so you can hopefully identify and repair some of these problems. What happens is that hopefully FHA, USDA, VA, appraiser goes in, he's got his government checklist, everything looks great, no problem at all. What happens sometimes, I would say maybe even 50% of the cases, because again, depending on the appraiser, some can be pickier than others, they will come back and say, okay, the value's fine, so let's just pretend the value's totally fine, no problem there. However, in order to write this FHA, USDA, VA loan, the peeling paint on the garage has to be scraped. There has to be a handrail installed. God forbid there's water coming into the basement, the cracks over, I think, 1/4 inch is what they're looking for. So you'll get this appraisal back, and they'll be like, great, value's great, bank won't write the loan because FHA won't write the loan because there's something wrong based on what this appraiser says. Again, if that happens, the agent will get a copy of that appraisal and start negotiating between the buyer and seller to get things fixed. There's some obvious ones that, like, well, the roof caved in. Well, obviously, but there's littler ones. Sometimes the seller balks at making a repair. The buyer offers to make the repair for them. I would not necessarily recommend that for the buyer or seller. Buyer is putting in time and money on a house they may not own. Seller is allowing some random stranger to come in their house and make repairs. Again, I don't really recommend that, although sometimes that has been suggested and has happened. Usually, the seller just makes the repair. If it's something small, something relatively inexpensive, they will just make the repair. So you'll have something like peeling paint on a door frame. That's something you see sometimes. Seller paints over it, and then they call the bank, and the bank sends the appraiser back out. Sometimes you can even just send pictures, but not always. And they're like, oh, okay, now you're fine, loan goes through. This safety structural, this FHA, USDA checklist can be a real pain in the butt, let's put it that way. But when you make these repairs, again, you're going to work it out between the buyer and seller. But, if you have to paint peeling paint, nobody says it has to match. If the buyer's going to move in and change it anyway, it doesn't have to be a big deal. I had a deal one time where it was like a tri-level, really cute house actually, and there was I think there were 3 stairs going, maybe 4 stairs going to the upper level. There was no handrail. So anything over 2 stairs in a house per FHA has to have a handrail. So I talked to my buyers, and what are we going to do here? And he's like, I don't want a handrail there. I'll remove whatever they do. So just tell the seller to put something in that's going to pass FHA, and then we're going to take it down anyway, and I'll fill in the holes and paint. Fine. So the seller did, I don't even remember, it was like a 2x4s. Like, it was sound, like it was structural, it could have worked, but it was ugly and it was cheap, but it passed FHA, which is awesome. That's all we needed. They got it in, ripped it down after they moved in, everything was fine. The other useful part of an appraisal outside an actual transaction where you have a buyer and seller working together, sometimes even the best real estate agent has a property in an area where there's a lot of question marks. It's either, maybe a custom built home that doesn't have a lot of comparables. Maybe it has something unusual with it. It's on 40 acres, or it, has a river running through the backyard, and it's, a beautiful sanctuary. I mean, there's certain things that it's very hard to pull a comparable property for. If you have a house in a subdivision that's about the same as all the other houses, super easy. Something custom, unusual, harder to find comparables. So sometimes what will happen is that an agent will advise a seller to get an appraisal prior to even listing it. Because then you have certainty about where to list it in the market, and obviously you can still, make changes and look at trends and stuff, and I don't want to say test the market out because I don't like that idea, but that's kind of what it is. The other thing is then you have that appraisal, so when you find a buyer, go under contract, find a buyer, there's no surprise. You might think your million square foot pole barn with heated floor and decorative lights adds $40,000 to the value of your house. An appraiser might not feel differently. Again, they have a very stringent set of guidelines that they use. So what you want to avoid is any kind of real surprise during a transaction. Again, if you do it prior to listing, you have some wiggle room. You can kind of find out if the pole barn is worth that much, or maybe you can upprice it a little bit because it seems important or something. But by getting that pre-listing appraisal, hopefully you'll avoid any horrible surprises and a deal falling apart and people being angry and heartache and all the other things that come along with it. So that's kind of the basics on appraisals. Again, the big thing is the timing of the appraisal, the fact that the appraiser doesn't work for anybody except for themselves, and possible pitfalls if you get an appraisal that's too low for your purchase price. If that happens, talk to your agent, talk to them about comparables, talk to them about, certain things that they can do in terms of market timing that they can demonstrate the appraiser. On the seller side, on the buyer side, talk to your agent about maybe not caring, because why do you want to prove it's worth more unless you really, really want the house? I would definitely, on the buyer side, if that happens, try to just start negotiations with the seller to get that price dropped. But either way, hopefully you have a very good agent who will have experience with this. That's really the big thing, because appraisers get crazy sometimes, but have experience with it that can guide you through if, God forbid, you get a bad appraisal. If you have any other questions about appraisals or literally anything else about real estate, mortgages, surveys, anything, how to fix up your house, sell it, whatever you need, call or text me anytime, 219-765-2062. You can comment on this video. You can send me a direct message through Facebook. I check my pages all the time and my chat all the time. You can find me at homesalesbyerica.com. On the upper, which way would that be? Right. You can click on blog. There's stuff that I've talked about, other information on other topics, other videos I've done. Feel free to stop by there. My Facebook page is homesalesbyerica.com. No, I guess Facebook/homesalesbyerica, I guess it would be. Again, the videos are on there, other information. Stop by the office, 1040 East Commercial here in Lowell. Some of you it may be a drive, but like I said, I do work all over this whole area. I've lived in Northwest Indiana my entire life, and I'm pretty familiar with most parts of it. So even if you just have a random question, contact me anytime. I'm happy to help. All right, you guys have a good weekend, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks.